Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to the second episode of our Distance and Learning Hour from Cachawilacuna. And, this is a different gathering from last week, and next week will be a different gathering from this week. And that's part of the fun of this work we do together. And welcome everybody. And before we even talk about kind of what we might do today, I think let's just go around and introduce ourselves. Can we just introduce ourselves and pass it on to someone else? So I'm Richard Fletcher, Associate Professor in the Department of Arts Administration, Education and Policy. And I am currently teaching a class on global Indigenous arts education for settlers. And I'm part of the Cachawilacuna community. And I'll pass it on to Alcira.
Thank you, Richard. This is Alcira Dueñas. Very, very interested in everything Andean that we can do, past and present. Of course, I am a historian and I actually teach a lot of courses regarding indigenous cultures and civilizations from the past. But I'm very interested in bringing that past to the present. So that's my pedagogical tool, so that my students get involved. So Cachawilacuna, it's a perfect venue to do that because I joined scholars in other disciplines who are really very interested in working with contemporary indigenous issues. So I think this is my reason for being here. I hope to be able to get to know Kurt, Amanda, and Indigo, whom I didn't know before, more directly and to get to work together with everybody. Thank you.
Who will you pass it on?
Sorry, I pass it on to Michelle.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see everybody here again. Michelle Wibblesman, Associate Professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And again, for those of you who don't know me, my background is in anthropology and ethnomusicology, working specifically in the Andes and Amazonia. So yes, I teach courses on indigenous cultures of Latin America. And right now I'm teaching a graduate seminar on that's titled Musical Migrations and Latin American Identities. And also, Kurt, you'll be excited to hear the ensemble in person. So we'll see how that goes. Yeah, how that goes this semester. And I'll pass it on to, I guess, Kurt, since I mentioned you.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see you again. It's been a very long time, it seems like. Let's see, I kind of became involved with the group during the lockdown when I spent a lot of time in Columbus, and I participated in the Andean Music Ensemble too, which was great. Oh, I'm in West Virginia, so that's why this Zoom is very ideal for me. But this sort of became a pretty important part of my life, and I'm really glad to have met everybody. I kind of work in a garment decoration business right now, so I have to deal with the guilt of pumping more consumer goods into the world. But by trade, I'm a musician, or by training, I'm a musician and an archivist. And I don't do any of that up here in West Virginia currently. So it was great to become involved with the Indian Music Ensemble, and through that, and through my brother Eric, I met this group, and it seems to be, well, how do I put it? I've been kind of dealing with the questions that this group addresses all by myself up here, and I didn't even know there were other people who thought about this. So it's like pretty much an immediate family. So thank you. And I will pass it on to Indigo.
Hi everyone, I'm Indigo Gonzalez. I'm an Afro-Indigenous Two-Spirit artist, educator, and historian here localized in Columbus and basically Ohio State. I'm excited to be here for the second recording of this really cool collective, and I'm interested to learn more. I navigate many projects at once, but currently I'm looking into returning back to Ohio State as a graduate student in global Indigenous arts. as well as explore my own printmaking craft that I've been working on since 2017. So I'm a printmaker by trade, but I explore many other mediums as well. And all of that is inclusive in my healing practice as an Indigenous medicine practitioner. So I'll pass it to Amanda.
Thanks, Indigo. Can you all hear me with my mask on? Yeah, okay. So my name's Amanda Tobin Ripley. I use she, her. I don't know why my Zoom is not showing my name or my pronouns correctly, but here we are. And I'm a first-year doctoral student in arts administration, education, and policy, and I'm taking Dr. Fletcher's class on global Indigenous art. And I'm coming from a background working in museum education at Mass MoCA in Western Mass, and last year worked closely with Wendy Redstar, who's an Apsáalooke artist, and just began a huge process of unlearning for myself in preparing curriculum to work with K-12 students around her exhibition and working with Wendy. So I'm looking forward to sort of continuing that process here and navigating how to be a white settler educator working with artists and using art. So thanks, excited to be here.
That leaves me. I'm Pamela Espinosa de los Monteros, and I am currently the Latin American Librarian and Latino Studies Librarian. My background is in information science, but I've been working in museums, schools, libraries, and a long time trying to bring in different voices to what is information, what is knowledge, and also working a lot with artists. So I'm like very honored to be part of this collaborative, and so nice to see you, even though I'm only going to be here briefly, sorry, but I always really get so much out of our conversations, and thank you for being here today.
And maybe I should mention on the heels of Pamela's comment, we have 4, and by association, potentially 5 of the co-PIs for the Cachawillaycuna project here today. So Alcira Dueñas, Pamela Espinosa de los Monteros, Richard Fletcher, myself, and by way of association, Eric Johnson, Kurt's brother. So we have a lot of co-PI representation, and I'm very grateful that you're here to kind of inform and brainstorm, during the conversation with us.
Thank you. So again, one of the exciting things about this is just not knowing who will be here for this short time that we have together, but always knowing that it will be a different group of people. And so, as Michelle said, having a good representation of the co-PIs is exciting. We might, that might actually change what we do today in relation to, because we have people that are here that are part of the project in its kind of engine room, as it were. So I do want to just spend 1 second just acknowledging that we are speaking to each other, but also to a potential audience because this is recorded. And I think that is important because it changes the way we speak to each other. And it also it gives us an opening onto potential people watching and listening. And so I just want to say something to those people who are watching and listening, that we want to hear from you. We want to learn what brings you to a belated watching of an unlearning hour. What does it mean to engage with us from this perspective? And I'm going to just share my screen briefly if I can. I remember last time it was, let me see if I can do it. So I'm just going to share an email that I sent to the Arts and Humanities, the informal kind of faculty list here, and I'll just read this email. So this is a kind of virtual invitation, as this email, no email can reach everybody, right? So there's no way in which we can do that. But so dear listeners, watchers, in the future, I hope you are well. You and yours are well and healthy. I am speaking to you to invite you to our Unlearning Hour, which happens every Friday at 11:30 to 12:30. at the following link. And so this is the link here. Again, if you're watching the video, how you'll be able to make sense of that. You may be able to write down the meeting ID or the password. And I'm speaking to anyone that's watching this in terms of, you know, maybe when someone's watching it on YouTube or however you're accessing this in the future. We have old recordings, and especially on the YouTube channel for Cachawilacuna for our work together. And just to say that we are starting our reading of our commissioned reader of Cassandra Press reader on Blackness, Indigeneity and Erasure. We're going to start today, as I suggested, with the context sheet, which is a series of TikToks from Black and Indigenous communities, people, individuals, and as we'll see, the kind of crossings that happen in relation to certain forms of Indigenous and Black life that respond to ongoing colonialism, questions of whiteness, but also interrelations between solidarities and lives that cross between and mix between these two representations and positionalities. I also have a link here, and we'll, you know, if you're watching this in the future, then the question of how you access this link might be that you contact the Cachawilacuna community, either, and therefore you might do that in relation to following us through the listserv. This is the reader, but one thing we want to ask, and this is why I'm really doing this strange, speaking to you, speaking to the future, speaking to people that are not here right now, is because we have a responsibility to the artists, Candice Williams and Alina Bayana, who edited this reader, and also the contributors to this reader, to reflect on the work that they have done and implement to some extent the work they've done, not only at the university here at Ohio State, but also far beyond in our unlearning practices. So I think it's very important that if you're watching this in the future, that we acknowledge that work as well. Also, as we acknowledge where we are grounded and located here at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, and the ancestral lands there. And actually, it's kind of useful if I keep scrolling down on my email. We have a personalized land acknowledgement that is made by Professor Marty Chat-Smith, who writes that I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands of many indigenous cultures, most recently home of the people of the Eastern Woodlands who migrated into the Ohio Valley after the European contact, the Shawnee, Wyandotte, Delaware, Miami, Ottawa, Peoria, Potawatomi, Seneca, Cayuga, and Chippewa or Ojibwe, among others. And the ancients known by their monuments, the people of the Adena, Hopewell, and Fort Ancient cultures. And so just again, welcome to those in the future, and let us kind of come back into the present. And maybe we can start by thinking about whether we want to jump in to the TikTok in the reader, or if we want to start from another place, given the people that we have with us today. Every hour we spend together, we start from scratch and we kind of think how we will unlearn together. So maybe, you know, is there any starting point we want to make, or do we want to jump into the reader? Any suggestions or reflections, or even a kind of shaking out of the last week? Sometimes that's useful too. Anything that has happened to us in our lives, in our work, in, you know, when we talk of unlearning, we are also talking about structures and practices that may inhibit a certain way of being in the world, which we, and I speak here personally as Amanda did before, as a white settler, that Indigenous art making, whether from the Andean and Amazonian regions or globally, makes us think twice about. And so, you know, are there things that we want to share in this forum that just starts that process or continues that process of unlearning? And we can go from there, or we can watch some videos, however we want to do it.
You know, I have a prompt, because, you know, the TikToks were really powerful. And this week there was a pretty powerful post that was made by a group of librarians that are identifying as Black, Indigenous, Latino, people of color, that were very strong about the pain that they've been feeling inside of the library and information science community. And it resonated with a lot of the things that are being shared with the TikTok. And I guess it was sort of, and to the readers, like some of the reader is how like, where do we go from here? In kind of bridging both an understanding of the trauma, and not past trauma, I mean like current trauma, like everyday exposure to the trauma. and also how can you promote another way of looking at things that don't invite cultural appropriation? So, like some things I'm preparing right now, this talk about emotional intelligence, which has been out forever. And, half of the stuff is, you can find it in Indigenous cultures. It's like in a different way of seeing things. But how do you kind of bring in that like that knowledge source without appropriating? And how do you, and then you become a filter yourself as a person that is not from those cultures. So it's just like a very delicate line of engagement. And it just doesn't, it's like the value of not doing these things and how to do it. There's not a lot of information of crossing that bridge. And so I guess I'd love to hear your insights about it, because I think that like a lot of the TikTok was trying to push us there, right? Or trying to say like, don't do that. But then if you don't do that, then what are the models that are doing this well?
And these are fundamental questions, Pamela, and I just wanted to circle back to the original impetus, not only the reading of the commissioned reader, but also the email. Or was it an email that was sent to the library, or was it a social media post, or was it?
It was a post signed by dozens of librarians talking about specifically to white librarians. Mm-hmm. It was pretty, I'll put it in the link.
Yeah.
But yeah, here, I'll put it. Look, I'll put it so you can see.
Okay, that sounds good. I mean, again, because I was just thinking about how you pivoted from that moment, again, something that's happened in your working week, in your professional week, and then how it then relates to the question of how to amplify support without appropriation. And I think that is one of the big issues of allyship, accompliceship, and in my past week, I've had a conversation with a collaborator that I'm working with on a virtual panel at a conference on disability studies and arts education. Their name is Victoria Freeman, and they are based in Toronto, and they have a long history of collaboration with Indigenous artists, community members in the Toronto area. And that they also have a personal story about a sister who was institutionalized through for intellectual disability. And this our panel, which brings together a survivor of a institution who is an Indigenous survivor of a institution for intellectual disabilities, as well as an Anishinaabe actor. And Victoria's work, whenever I talk to Victoria, I always realize that she's been doing this a long time. This hard question of how to be a white colonizer within solidarity with solidarity with Indigenous individuals and communities. And so, and we just had a conversation about how hard it is, and like how hard it is for her, even though she's been doing it for years and years and years. And so the answer, if we had like the answer among ourselves and in relation to Indigenous artists and communities, then we would, we would enact it. But it's not. I guess it's just being able to articulate how difficult it is a very important starting point. And just to flip back to the TikTok, I don't know what it would mean if we would go on, say, and start explaining the difficulty through that medium, because one of the things that we learned from that medium, and what Candice and Alina point us to in their context sheet, is how, and also with the article that's there, that's referenced later in the reader, is maybe that, that is not a space that needs to be kind of intervened in by us in this way. And so maybe TikTok actually could be a set of conversations that we're listening into, engaging with, but without kind of reproducing, without kind of trying to do it ourselves, kind of thing. And that's why I kind of like the TikTok entry into the reader, because I'm not going to start doing TikTok in order to have these dialogues, but I respect how something is being brought to a research group within Indigenous studies where it wouldn't be made that way without that medium of TikTok. So there's a kind of interesting question and conflict going on there.
I'll add, I just scanned through the link you sent, and I think where like TikTok is really strong is this idea of voluntelling. So like people like BIPOC having to like volunteer and say, look, this is why I'm affected by this event that just happened. And like me myself, like I'm in the intersections of so many identity markers that ever since I was like a little kid, I've had to do that. And so what I think TikTok does is it gives agency to like BIPOC people, even like all spectrums, like mental health spectrums, like economic spectrums, the ability to like post something out of their own volition, type what they want as the caption, edit it how they want, and then say, here, now you can see this version of it, and you can't like, you can leave comments, but it still doesn't, it won't change what it's actually out there, versus like having to go through institutions, say, okay, well, I'm going to give this, I don't know, this like lecture or this like information session on why I'm being affected, my community is affected, and having direct feedback from people saying, well, where's the pamphlet to help me figure this out? TikTok's like, you have 30 seconds to understand. If you don't, I really don't care, because you'll go to the next video. And so I think like this voluntelling concept on TikTok is like directly challenging that idea of having to do that for prolonged periods of time or multiple times. So like I've had to give numerous amounts of what is Thanksgiving meaning to me since I was like a teenager, and having to be, and then being relied upon of like, oh, can you come do this? And sometimes I'm like, yeah, sure. Other times I go and I talk about something completely different because I get fed up answering that question. And so it's like what's also really cool about TikTok, and at least what was on the contact sheet, is they had a lot of examples of like Afro-Indigeneity and how that's really not involved in these conversations, especially around Indigenous stuff. And I've been in both worlds. I've been in spaces where it's like, this is for Black people and only Black people should be here, and how there's really no Indigenous voice, and then vice versa in the Native community. And so what like TikTok is allowing to do as like the medium is give visual representations of like, here's Black Native people, they've existed forever, here's a direct, if you need the visual evidence, here it is, versus like someone saying a theory or anthropological jargon of how this could have happened at some point by someone recording it, so I could go on forever, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, but that's
Thank you, Indigo.
point. And I think that in many ways, it kind of points us potentially to some of the practices, right? So personal engagement, right? Bringing in voices of Indigenous artists, Indigenous people in general into untranslated, uninterpreted, right? Into these spaces, I think is absolutely critical. And as I've been listening to Pamela, to Indigo, to Richard, I'll speak to Amanda here, but the thing that it comes to our immediate application has to do with the open house for the Andean and Amazonian Indigenous art and cultural artifacts collection, where we were exactly at this crux and this intersection that Pamela mentions about how do we engage, Indigenous epistemologies? What is the fine line that we walk between that and appropriation? And we've had these discussions with Indigo as well as a visitor to our collection, and also creating a practice like a ceremony in our space, right? So I think that those are exactly the things that we have to work out with student curators, raising those questions and simply planting that seed of saying, what are even ways that we talk about our exhibits, or that we talk about the people that we're representing. How do we bring those into our own sort of dialogues as students who work very closely? And then the moment that we have to sort of be the interface with a broader audience, then all of those questions sort of amplify. So at least I think that what we're trying to do is a lot of activities-based and applied events, like activities that people can engage, and while they're doing something, potentially understand by way of doing, right? And telling at the same time. I think that we do implement ethnographic rigor into what we know about the collection, and informing ourselves, reading up, on anything, speaking to artists directly. So lots of interviews. And just thinking about TikTok versus, for example, podcasts, that have some sort of a dialogue going on, or radio shows. Very interesting to think about those mediums and the fact that they don't. It's not just different mediums for the same message, but that the medium defines like the whole context and the interaction as well, right? But the other thing that I wanted to mention is that while we do talk about like being rigorous in terms of our attempt to gain some knowledge about what we're talking about, we also consider it kind of a playful space, right? A playground of ideas, where we experiment. For example, Amanda, maybe you can speak about this, but we have to come up with like our own artistic sort of interpretations and ideas to implement into the displays. And that actually is a space where we can't divorce playfulness from rigor, right? But it's actually an incredibly productive space from my perspective, and also a collaborative space. So in any case, we welcome any feedback, because this is exactly the intersection that we're at and that we're heading towards for this October 5th event, and trying to navigate it in meaningful ways.
Well, thank you. And I'm so sad that I have to go, but this is like I'm always at the intersection of the filter before, because I present white. So it's like white people come to me first, and then they move on. And so it's just very interesting to have the dilemma, and also working with adults, because it's different. Their risk tolerance is a lot lower, in my experience. So they they are, their, what should I say, their attention level to this segment, to like they want to unlearn, they want to for a moment, and then when it's the pain hits them, for the first time, they kind of freak out. And most of the time I'm getting them back in, like watching them retreat back into the cave, right? And so it's been challenging. And then trying to design things that are like, let me get you out of the cave so you can experience some of the spaces that Michelle and Richard and Indigo and Alcira are making, and I'm sure Amanda too, and Kurt's has been really challenging. But please continue the conversation. I'm going to listen to the recording, and hopefully if my meeting doesn't run, I'll be back.
Thanks, Pamela.
I just wanted to mention something. I don't mean to stop the conversation about TikTok. I browsed the contact sheet that Richard shared with us, but I wanted to thank you, Indigo, because you gave me a lot of context about TikTok and the audience and the people who use it. I'm not really into much of these kinds of things, but I know of it because my grandson is a fan of TikTok, and I see that in very young people, that they're very much into that. And when I went through the contact sheet, it really struck me as to the urgency to expression. People really need to express themselves, and they go to any lengths to do it. And that's really amazing to see the vibrancy of these expressions and how also the body is presented and used in these kinds of things. So I kept thinking, and I keep thinking about, is that a tool that I could use in the classroom, for example? And how should I use it? Same questions that Michelle posed before, and Richard as well, and you, Indigo. But I don't want to talk too much about it because I'm not the right person to speak, authoritatively about TikTok. I just wanted to share because Richard mentioned at the beginning that we could talk about our professional week before. I happened to unlearn something through somebody who is actually, or some group of people that are working, and the issue here is the new understanding that I gathered about land grant and the mission of land grant universities. Maybe most of you are aware, I wasn't, about this podcast that was publicized from the College of Education and Human Ecology. It's called Inspire, and it talks about the revelations, actual new information that was published in a book by one of our colleagues at Ohio State, and a group of people who are, I believe they also are in one of the teams of the discovery teams. They're working on I think they call this a social justice fund. They are creating these funds so that Ohio State begins to sort of repair, the damages caused to indigenous communities because of the land grant idea and practice and things. But what I learned or unlearned, I guess, this week from this podcast is how the issue of land grant is not just that the universities began to function in lands that belong to indigenous peoples in the past. It's not just that. That idea is even larger than that. And it's actually way larger because it means that universities nationwide, including Ohio State, participated in a process of dispossession of many other indigenous lands that were sold against their consent, that they were perhaps even purchased forcefully, undervalued, and things like that. So I learned, for example, that Ohio State received money from land sales that took place in California, from indigenous peoples from California. And then the government was the middleman in this process. This started in 1862, actually, with the Morrill Act, I think it was called. where the whole land grant idea began. But it wasn't just to give the lands for the campus to function. It was to receive endowed funds from land sales that took place all over the country. And about 50 universities benefited from this money. So now the conversation that this group is proposing is, okay, Ohio State can do something different, right? Can contribute to repair somehow the damage caused. And they started out this group started out this social justice fund, but then they're now trying to expand this into a larger project. And the idea now is, okay, here we are, this group of faculty members with this good consciousness and intentions, but the indigenous communities are the ones who have to say what is that they want, how is that they want it done, and to have their own voices, right? So then there's the question of us as scholars, which is what I wanted to bring to the conversation when we talk about extending our connections with indigenous communities out there, or indigenous leaders, or even non-indigenous leaders, but people who are, in the same purpose with us. So what is our role, and to what extent we should go and do things or propose things that perhaps may not be agreed upon by the indigenous actors that we are trying to reach out to. So is this kind of boundary that I don't want it to be a boundary, but it's to what extent our good intentions and our good ideas are trampling on somebody else's autonomy or ability to decide their future. So how to go about these relationships and this interaction without, disrupting or violating inadvertently, perhaps with good intentions, which is always tricky, somebody else's own desire and right to decide what to do about themselves, right? So I just brought up this podcast thing that I listened to, and I can share the link if you want to listen to it. I can put it in the chat so that you can just go. And it was a very, very good conversation where somebody interviewed a group of faculty members about this idea of the land grant and what has happened throughout the years, and the dimension, the real big dimension of this situation. So that was my unlearning. I thought I knew a little bit of land grant, but I didn't know anything really. So it's something I wanted to just chime in with. Not to, cut the conversation about TikTok by any means, but just throw in the pot this alternative theme.
Thank you, Alcira, for sharing that. One thing I would say, again, this maybe comes from a place of someone that creates a radio show that when it's archived becomes a podcast. So OSU, I think we've seen a lot of this happening, right? We've seen a lot of a way in which this medium, and it is really interesting, Michelle also directed us to this place, what kind of medium are we describing here? And one thing I'd look out for in relation to this, a podcast that comes from a settler institution, also from settler scholars within that settler institution as well, so non-Indigenous scholars within that institution, even if there are participating Indigenous voices within that program, is how do Indigenous-led programs, initiatives relate to these activities, right? So one thing I've been very grateful for in my own work with the radio show Dear Fellow Settler Colonizer was that thanks to it being the first 5 episodes being focused on settlement, the settlement project, which is Indigenous digital occupation, which was meant to take place in Plymouth, UK as part of the, or as kind of critique of the Mayflower 400 celebrations, I got to know Ginger Dunnell, who is the producer of a podcast called Broken Boxes, which is an Indigenous-led, Indigenous-focused podcast. And Ginger actually asked, and we talked about how those first 5 episodes would be reposted on Broken Boxes as part of settler allies in relation to the main focus of the work of that podcast. And I just, that was very important to me as someone that was doing this work. It wasn't just sufficient that I was in dialogue with Indigenous artists, having music by Indigenous artists with compensation, but the fact that the kind of infrastructure of the Broken Boxes podcast became the kind of medium through which, or the mechanism through which, Indigenous communities and artists would kind of engage and listen. And so one kind of extension of this Alcida in relation to the land grant is, what does Ohio State University do to show that their production of, whether it's a podcast, whether it's an article, whether it's a round table or whatever, actually is claimed by Indigenous communities that they are offering solidarity with. And I think that is, it's complex, but I think it's very important that we don't just there are stages to this unlearning, right? And acknowledging the land grab history of this institution is one, but not replicating it through the media through which we then claim to be correcting it as well. That's my 2 cents in response to that. I'll put Broken Boxes into the chat so you can get the direct from them.
I had a question actually about TikTok, more specifically. So just one of the points that came up last time in our conversation was about how people bring in music, or they're aware of sort of like the background, the backdrop for their videos. Some of them systematic, if they post multiple videos where they have a similar familiar, type of background or music or setting that is inviting to people and recognizable immediately, like that type of thing. So just thinking about Indigenous art, what comes to my mind in terms of the TikTok is the intertextuality of it, right? So that there's a mixing of like the narrative and the music and the background, that all sort of tells a story, right? But the other question, so that was one question just to sort of bounce off of everybody. The other question, though, has to do with the length that we also mentioned last time, and that these are very brief. But any of us who have worked with Indigenous communities or, been in touch with Indigenous artists know that the conversations are often pretty lengthy, right? And I've experienced situations in the field where, for example, working with ritual ceremonies for the tourists, people were instructed to shorten it, to cut it down, and the shamans were very irritated by that, saying, what are they going to get out of it? If it's shortened, then it loses all of its value. What are we doing here, right? So my question has to do with the length, of the TikToks, and kind of this tendency toward nugget size or bite size information pods that we've kind of gravitated toward with shorter and shorter time spaces for really expressing, and how those relate to potential tendencies to essentialize or stereotype, or again, sort of like summarize, whether it's Indigenous identities or whether it's any sort of cultural description, right? So what is that problematic? Maybe TikTok overcomes some of that. It does something interesting, right? But I'm just kind of left wondering about those questions. For those of the younger audiences that are more into TikTok, this question goes out to you.
Could I mean, we've got about just over 10 minutes left. I just thought, just to kind of maybe illustrate some things that you're saying, Michelle, could I just play one of the TikToks?
Sure.
Actually, maybe two. I think two might do it in terms of the complexity of what you're saying, especially in relation to music, questions of appropriation, questions of direct access. Let me just, so I'm going to share my screen with the actual reader. Let me get it. So let me do this. Here we go. This is the best way. Okay. And then I've got to share my sound as well. So this is the reader, and what we're talking about is the first pages of the reader. So notice here it says context sheet, TikToks on indigeneity, blackness and erasure. And notice also this article here, like deep within the reader, by Jessica Lawyer, who's a Métis writer, about indigenous TikTok is transforming cultural knowledge. And I would also recommend, if you go to that article, that actually there are underlined sections, and although they don't work as links in the reader, if you find the original article, I think it's in the Canadian Art Magazine, you can use links there, because I think the links actually work there. So anything underlined in that is a link to a TikTok, actually going to the TikTok website. But what Candice Williams and Alina Bayana did for our reader was to create links for the TikTok videos so that we can engage with it. You can print out the reader, or you can engage with it like this through the PDF. And these are the two that I was going to just share with you, and just so you can. So this was one of them. It's just called Make It Indigenous. And so when you click on it, it opens up another page. Do you see the other page, or do I have to change? Okay. And I will play that now. Okay, Tia Wood is the person that created that, and that was one instance of music that we're talking about here. And then if I go back to do we see now the TikTok links? I'll just go to the one next to it here, which shows a different marker of the question of music and appropriation.
But if I'm so wrong, explain to me why there's all black schools or all black cafes. But just imagine if it was an all white cafe, whites only.
There's no black-only colleges, there's no black-only cafes, there was white-only everything, and the reason why it's become socially acceptable for black people to say certain things and unacceptable for white people is because black people were treated like shit and excluded for the majority of this country's history by white people. I don't know why the fuck you brought up cultural appropriation, because that's only when you're using elements from a culture to belittle or make fun of people of that culture, or you're changing the way you act based on a stereotype of a perceived culture. When it comes to police shootings, nobody's ever looked at a victim who's white, who was unjustly killed, and said, oh, they knew the cause. You guys just think that because you think any opportunity to gain equality for black people is anti-white, which is why people call you racist. You had some damn audacity to use a pro-black artist in Kendrick Lamar's song in the background to push your racist propaganda. Please open a history book, study, and don't fucking say anything on this app when it comes to that unless you know what the fuck you're talking about. Have a good day and never speak on this issue again.
Okay.
I love him. I love him. I love him. I love him. I've watched it 1,000 times. I love him so much. I love him.
Can you tell us more about why?
Well, like I've done a lot of like mentoring, but also like in and out of communities and being around younger people, even though I'm not that old. But there's like this shift with the Gen Z that is like getting out that immediacy and that aggression that like young millennials like myself weren't able to do quite yet, because we're still dealing with like that transition. Being like a 90s kid versus like a 2010s kid is like way different, and so it's to me, him just like talking is like if I was on the phone with him and he was like, I need to tell you something, and goes off. And that's something that is so common with like the Gen Z and young millennials where we just can't hold it anymore because we're seeing all of the impact and like this massive pressure, I would say from like, I don't know, like the 50s, like World War II, let's say, that has just been like being compressed in America, and then the 70s compressed with all the stuff that was happening. 9/11's coming up, more compression. Like a lot of people don't, like, I don't remember like what was like before 9/11, right? And so even though I was around to have an impact of it happening, so Gen Z is like, oh, it's always been this way. So now imagine like all the stuff that's happened in the past like 6 years, I want to say, and having those kids have that same weight on them. Like, how am I supposed to do things in this world when there's still this stuff going on? And so having these blips of these incredible kids articulating stuff that they would think, oh, you're too young to understand, it's because they've lived it. And because of the social media, news, access, and quick access, they can make that critical analysis themselves any time of day when they're on the bus, between classes, chilling, eating some hot Cheetos. I mean, we're always digesting critical analysis and making it a part of our normal dialogue than having it be for the academics. And so that's much more accessible. Sometimes it can be problematic, but a lot of times it's really, really great to do that with your like peer. So I just love him so much. Brings me joy.
And obviously the specific, so Pamela just rejoined us and we were just watching a couple of the TikToks. So maybe when you watch the recording, you can see which ones they were that Indigo was showing a lot of love towards. And, the juxtaposition that Elise was offering there was this question of appropriation and, that the young man in that TikTok who was calling out someone for, racist comments about why aren't there white only spaces, or like if there were white only spaces then that would cause outrage and this kind of thing. That one of the key parts of his critique was, and then you're playing Kendrick Lamar in the background as you say this stuff, and how that contrasts or relates at all to how music is utilized in the other clip that we saw, which was about making it indigenous, and how those kinds of questions of a banjo that plays a certain kind of music genre can then be transformed by indigenous creatives into something that actually is akin to their musical heritage and history. So, how, is it that there are different rules, or is it that it really matters who is saying and doing what on this app, in what relationship you are making to what you're saying and doing? And that, back to Michelle's point, intertextuality, like the connections there are really important. And then back to Indigo's point, like the spontaneity of this as well, the spontaneity of these connections is really vital.
I still think that part of Michelle's comments is still warrants more conversation, which is about the time, right? I'm always very worried about this compressed and this systematic pressure to make it shorter. I understand the benefits of that, but I also am worried about that, because then in pushing towards shorter stuff, and taking more numerous amounts of short stuff, you run the risk not to be able to think critically, right? I mean, you do it beautifully, Indigo, and I wish my students were as brilliant as you, most of them, but they cannot see the larger picture most of the time because they are overwhelmed with information. Lots of information can be overwhelming, and in the worst case scenario can lead to plain ignorance. I'm sorry to say, because you cannot grasp anything properly. So I am struggling with that in my classes, and I would like to hear more about how to approach this kind of format, because I can hear my students being also really very bored and unmotivated with having to read a book, or with having to read 20 pages reading for each day, right? But I want to find a middle ground, or somehow how to combine things, or how to, yes, use the little format, yes, we can use it, but not make it, the norm in the class, right? And to combine and have the students exposed to different things. I don't know. I would like to hear more about this.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in there because I hear you, Alcide. I totally hear you about potentially like some of the frustrations that we've experienced, with bullet point type of approaches in the classroom and stuff like that. But I wonder if there's something really different going on here, right? Where it captures the urgency that Indigo is talking about. For example, when we think about rap, also in that rapid fire, of lyrics, like they have to get it all out, get it all in. There's something about that it creates like an effect, an explosion in a compressed sort of context, right? And then the other thing that I want to point out is that we shouldn't assume, right? We shouldn't just sort of generalize across the medium. So going back to the medium, so the medium is the method, and the method is the message, right? So it's not the same, the message across different mediums, it changes, right? But the one thing that I wanted to mention is that in indigenous contexts, there are the keepers of the words, right? And Kurt knows what I'm talking about with the gritos, or certain words, right? That the keepers of the words point to that as it's just an expression. It sort of punctuates discourse, but everything is held within it, right? So then I think about the brevity of the TikTok. Potentially that compression could be something really productive, and not that it's critical thinking, non-critical thinking, but different types of thinking, across those realms. I don't know. It's exciting to think about.
I think that's something that we lack in the traditional academic format. We don't have a space for the human emotion, for the human expression of, like I know in the Quechua world, for example, and I know this from experience, not because I know Quechua at all, because I don't. Somebody whom I met in a bus traveling in Peru, she was telling me that her mother has passed away, right? And when she started talking about it, she paused. And then she sort of expressed like a lament or lamentation with like her hand like this, and she stops talking for about a few seconds, and then she resumes talking, right? That really stopped me on my tracks, because I thought, oh my goodness, this is part of the very meaning of the thing that she's trying to express. It's just the gesture, the emotion that comes from within at some point. And I think that your point is very well taken, Michelle, in that sense, right? We need to provide a space also, in the not only in the classroom, but in life, right? For that kind of accepting, all kinds of languages. That's part of language, I think, right? So in that sense, the TikTok, that's why it's more, that's why young audiences are more attuned to that, perhaps because we already grew up in another kind of attitude towards the media. And then perhaps we don't get it, but it's there, right? It is there.
So everyone, we've reached the hour, and I'm annoying at that person that has to kind of end things when we could go on for another hour. I do want to acknowledge at this moment that it is thanks to the work of Candice Williams and Alina Bayana and the Cassandra Press reader that we are even having this conversation about TikTok. Their decision to start their reader with this context sheet this was commissioned by our project, but that was their decision. And so I actually think that when we resume this conversation next week, we may stay with the TikTok, and when the following week after, we may stay with the TikTok. And I don't think it might not be exhausted. And maybe that might be one way in which we can think of this problem or question of attention and of the soundbite is, it may be that on the app you move from one to the other, but what happens if we stay with it? And I think that Candice and Alina have asked us to do that a little bit. So thank you for everyone's voices, perspectives. Thank you, those of you watching in the future, for your attention, and we're going to continue. We'll be meeting same time next week, and have a good rest of your day and weekend. And again, thank you for your presence.